sort of an announcement of the results, which we hope will be positive. So that's more or less the procedure. Will take a little while. And if you, once you leave the room after the presentation, if you would like, you could go to Erman 210. I know that, for example, Brandon here in front could take you there, where we'll meet afterwards, and we'll relax and hopefully celebrate. So that's more or less the procedure. Bear in mind that we want this to be happy and relaxed in some point, but it's still a formal procedure for an exam. So without much further ado, I just want to say a few words about how Jordan started this work, and then it's really his. So as I mentioned, a long time ago, actually now, over 5 years ago, I gave a colloquium in the physics department about some of the things I do. And so I'm a physicist, but I became always interested in people. And Jordan, I think, shares some of this, which is sometimes a difficult balance. But Jordan was very interested in issues of how we use methods of statistical mechanics. So the way in which physicists look at systems and statistics and dynamics, how they move, and how these may represent a society under certain goals. This is a problem that's kind of as old as science itself, maybe older than that, maybe going back to philosophy and the Greeks and everything. But in some way, it's a problem that remains somewhat open because it's very complex. And I think Jordan's thesis makes progress in the direction of understanding what this is, particularly in view of problems of how societies develop, how they create and mitigate inequalities, and also how people come to work together in teams and when that matters. And I think in his thesis, there are some fundamental results that are new about the structure of information, about how that can come about, which is, I think, an interesting and important contribution to statistical mechanics in complex systems. So without much further ado, it's really time to have Jordan tell you about it. Jordan, please.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Also, thank you guys so much for being here, especially for those of you that traveled to be here. Thank you for my committee for taking the time out of their schedule to help me fulfill this. So just a quick side note, I'm recovering from a cold, so I might take a moment here and there to catch my breath, but please bear with me throughout this. So the problem of adaptation, that's what my talk will be about today. Adaptation is all around us, even in ways that we might not realize. Of course, obviously, there's natural selection, what we're familiar with from biology. There's also social adaptation. How do we become accustomed to a new community that you join? There's also industrial adaptation. How could a firm adapt how it processes information and goods to satisfy the needs of an economy? With so many different ways that adaptation could apply in our world, it's really important to understand develop a method of how to understand that. And so scientists have been developing methods to think about adaptations for, as we've said, for as long as history. I think some work done by Mr. Warren Weaver in the 20th century can help us really understand how we can apply concepts from math and physics towards answering those questions. So Warren Weaver was a science publicizer, a big proponent of applying scientific method to everyday problems. And he wrote this really wonderful work in the, like I said, in the 20th century about how we can apply math to different problems of varying complexity. And so the first type of problem that he outlines is our problems of simplicity. And these are problems that physicists are most familiar with. It's problems similar to like energy transfer between particles colliding, as I've given as an example there. You can think of many different cases, but this is understandably a little bit too simplistic to understand something as complex as adaptation and behavior. So he also gave us this way of thinking about disorganized complex problems. So in these types of systems, we accept that the dynamics of, say, a particle are too complicated to think about as, on a case-by-case basis. So instead, we think about distributions of particles, distributions of energy, as I've plotted or I've shown here in the case of like a particle in a box colliding with many other boxes or many other particles. And so in this sense, it's disorganized in that we don't really describe the dynamics of the particle itself, and instead we think about what's happening macroscopically. So we think about state variables like volume or temperature that are independent. And most importantly, it's often history-free. So when we sample this system at one point in time and then sample it later, we wouldn't necessarily think the dynamics would change. And so this second case, this disorganized complex approach, is what a lot of the literature has done up until now in trying to understand adaptive adaptive systems, at least from the general perspective. And so this is done often through through Brownian motion, which I've given the stochastic differential equation for here. And so in this case, your quantity x evolves on every time step with some deterministic component that represents what we know about the system, with some noisy, some stochastic term represented by this sigma in this dwt. And so the way to think about this is that our quantity will drift on average with some gamma and some fluctuation. And that looks something like this, where our particle will move if it's the case of a spatial object with some uncertainty. And where usually these fluctuations, this dw called a Wiener process, is sampled from a Gaussian. And so if we were to animate this in 2D and see what it looks like, it's something like this, where you can see sort of on average, these particles are moving towards the top right of the screen, but each particle itself is fluctuating quite wildly. So it's difficult to see exactly what's going on. And just to pause and give some definitions for the rest of the talk. When I say stochastic, what I mean is that the behavior is sampled from a probability distribution. In that case, this is random dynamics. And when I talk about noise, I mean particular fluctuations in behavior. And so we'll call this randomness. And so these Brownian motion systems have some nice characteristics that make them really convenient for studying complex systems with. One example is that when we take the population average, this usually with a large enough sample converges to some deterministic process. And so what I've done in this animation here is shown that if we average over all these particles, we get some average motion that is moving relatively noise-free. They also have a nice property that if you average their dynamics over time, you get just all your fluctuations cancel out, and you get some deterministic drift. And so in systems where this population average equals this time average, we get what are called ergodic dynamic systems. And these are really convenient for studying complex processes because it just makes things simpler to work with, but also starts to hint at what are some of the underlying, whatever that ergodic quantity is really determining the underlying dynamics. And we'll talk a little bit about how this emerges in adaptive systems a little bit later. And so this non-equilibrium approach, and by non-equilibrium, I mean we have some flow of energy into the system through this motion. Scientists across disciplines from physics to ecology have been able to study a lot of complex processes, particularly interaction dynamics between predator and prey, replicator dynamics where you're studying the balance of genes in an evolving population, as well as the study of the dynamics of wealth, and particularly inequality. And so for this talk, we're going to be focusing on applications towards the dynamics of wealth inequality. And we're going to be using a model called geometric Brownian motion, and I'll just describe that in the next slide. But the general point of this first part of the talk is that we're going to be studying an adaptive process. But as you might have picked up, we don't actually have an adaptive mechanism. We basically have some drift and some noise. And so we'll explore why this can be problematic and really understanding how the system works. And then my dissertation is basically proposing a theory for adaptation and then showing how that cleans up some of these issues, as well as unlocks a whole new rich world of new dynamics to explore. And so I'll be talking about that first part here in the introduction. In the first part of the talk, I will introduce that adaptive mechanism and then use it to study this problem of inequality. And then in the last two parts of the talk, we will expand this discussion towards understanding competitive and cooperative behavior. Okay. So I mentioned before we're going to study geometric Brownian motion. The way that you get that from Brownian motion is you plug in the log of this quantity resources so that your differential now becomes something like this. And your dynamics look now what we are plotting here. We're on the right. If we look at the dynamics on the log coordinates, we get something that looks like Brownian motion, so linear with fluctuations. But on the left side, we get some exponential behavior with some noise. And so exponentials are great. They're used a lot for studying systems where dynamics are proportional to the quantity at any point in time, which is used a lot in in studying financial systems or in growth, systems of growth. And so this is what the solution looks like here. So just a linear equation with a drift and a fluctuation term. And we see here that the ergodic quantity becomes our growth rate. And as we'll see in a couple slides later, this growth rate really holds all the interesting features of our dynamics, whereas we might have assumed it would be resources, but as we'll see later, it's this. Okay. So when we plug in that solution to the Fokker-Planck equation, so we can really build out this distribution that I mentioned earlier is necessary, we get something that looks like this, and this is basically a normal distribution in log coordinates. And this log normal distribution and dynamics that produce log normal distributions are used often in what they call econophysics. So using physical tools to study dynamics of wealth, sometimes financial systems as well, particularly for their ability to naturally produce inequality in addition to growth. And so this figure from a paper in 2017 demonstrates this behavior where on this left plot, we're showing as a function of time the relative population the relative size of a population of agents. So if we think about each trajectory as being the wealth of a single agent, and then setting one to be the sum over, so we're normalizing it, this tells us which agent is dominating the resources of the whole population. And so we see at early times, every agent starts out with relatively the same amount of wealth, but at long times, one agent is guaranteed to dominate. And that dominance really persists. And sometimes it might change, but usually not. And we can also see this by studying Gini, which is a metric for inequality. The key way to think about this is when it's 0, you have total equality. So every agent has the same amount of resources. When Gini is equal to 1, you have one agent that has roughly all of it relatively. And so we see that in a system driven by this volatility term, the sigma, we have Gini that goes to 1 in a pretty finite time and just stays at 1. So this is a really nice generator of inequality. And so we're going to call these systems that are driven by just volatility homogeneous, in the sense that on average, every agent's growth rate is 0, and we're just leaving it up to these fluctuations to drive inequality. And the population variance looks something like this, where it's just the volatility squared times time. And so this is, like I said, used across the literature for fitting and understanding, diagnosing the problem of inequality, understanding how particularly it's evolved in the context of the US economy, as well as to just develop toy models as well. But this comes with some shortcomings. First of all, it's as I mentioned before, it's pretty phenomenological in that we don't know where does gamma come from? Where does the volatility come from? Why do some agents win and some lose? And second, particularly about the homogeneous treatment, it really implies that luck is the only thing that matters in determining the evolution of inequality. And if we ask if that's a reasonable assumption, hopefully the answer is no, because we like to believe that the decisions that we make really matter in determining our future. So it's better to have, yeah, I'll leave it at that. So no, doesn't matter, or it's not a good assumption. And so this has been realized by the literature as well. So in this research from 2016, some people tried fitting a GBM-based model to the top 1% percentile of income data with a homogeneous model on the left over time. And they found that when they fit to early parameters, the fit and the actual data diverge, where this dotted line is the fit. But when they assume some heterogeneity, so some agents have different growth rates, they get a much better fit over time. So clearly in the data, there's some heterogeneity that we need to really capture. So what happens when we take that log normal solution and add some heterogeneity to it? And so that's what we did for my first project. We basically convolved the log normal solution with a Gaussian distribution of growth rates and resources, and found that some rich dynamics emerged. And so again, we're looking at the variance in resources. We see at initial times, of course, that's the variance is given by your variance and initial resources. In intermediate times, given by this t to the first power, we have our volatility term from before, but as well as a covariance term. So there's some interaction between the distribution of resources and growth rates. And then lastly, and most importantly, on long timescales, we have this growth rate variance term. So this is saying really that heterogeneity over long timescales dominates that inequality or that the variance. And so we can simulate this using Monte Carlo simulations, introducing heterogeneity to a population and just asking how does the volatility or the variance evolve over time, comparing heterogeneous to homogeneous populations. And we see that pretty clearly, with the exception of some cases of high volatility. A heterogeneous population becomes super unequal as their Gini goes to 1 really quickly. So the question is, you know, can we first explain where this heterogeneity might come theoretically, and then more importantly, can we derive a mechanism that manages this heterogeneity over time, so that we can think about if the goal is to manage inequality in populations, so that we actually have some guidance towards that. So I left out part of the discussion from earlier. There's actually a third way to think about scientific problems, and that's problems of organized complexity, where we're still thinking about the distribution of some quantity, but we're now introducing its dependence on some underlying complex processes. And so I've represented that with some x of t and y of t. They could have known relationships. The main point is that this is some history-dependent dynamics. And we're deriving dynamics for an agent. Sorry, I'm getting a little lightheaded. Deriving dynamics for an agent. And we're going to say that they need to essentially manage energy in their environment. And this is a realistic assumption. This is what we do on a day-to-day basis. Of course, we do this in some broader environment. And so to start with, for the simple model that we looked at in my work, while this model can be social, natural, or built, we kind of just package it all into one thing. And we're going to say that this environment rewards agents for making smart predictions about the future. And so the upshot from this assumption is that when agents allocate the resources in a forward-thinking manner, the growth they experience is proportional to the information they have about their environment. And then that places information as the central quantity that we want to study. And then using the properties of information theory, we can explore other things like inequality, as I mentioned, is an issue before, as well as understanding other things like cooperation, competition, et cetera. And so, like I said before, we want to keep things simple. So we're going to treat the environment as a black box that has some statistical properties that the agent can interact with, particularly events and signals, and I'll talk about what that means in a sec. So that means we're basically going to be focusing on just that interaction with the environment, not so much what the environment is itself. And so you could be asking, like, why not economics? The problem mostly is that this is fundamentally a non-equilibrium problem, whereas a lot of econ is derived for studying equilibrium systems. And we've particularly focused on statistical dynamics as the foundation of this theory. And so we're borrowing some inspiration from these two papers here, but essentially progress made by biophysicists in understanding how bacteria and other species gather resources from their environment. So that's kind of the motivation. So now let's actually explore how this system works and how it can address this problem of understanding inequality, like I mentioned in the introduction. So in describing how this system works, essentially we have an agent, like I mentioned before, trying to predict future states of the environment. So some states E, we call these events, with some reward. And so this particular reward is called a fair reward. It's not necessary that this type of assignment isn't necessary, but it just makes the math convenient and it doesn't change the outcome of the theory. But we're going to say particularly that agents make a decision conditioned on some private signal they receive from their environment, where that signal has some predictive power over that future event. And so agents then, with that signal, allocate resources towards the event with some betting matrix B. And so when agents, when we set up the theory like this, we get a diagram that looks like what's drawn here, where the agent observes a signal, They consult their knowledge about the environment and then make an allocation as they do in D. And then some event from the environment is sampled, and if the agent guesses it properly, they get some reward. And so to look at the math of how resources actually evolve under that kind of dynamic, we can consult this equation here, where in this first formulation, we see that we're basically counting over every single allocation the agent makes. And then because this is a proportional dynamic, this is a multiplicative. This turns out to be multiplicative. But we can reorganize this equation to think now about just counting over events, combinations of events and signals. And so we get this W, which is basically just like counting each of those combinations. And so over many samples, this W, if we divide it by n, it converges to a probability distribution. So if we then went to calculate the growth rate from this, where we're taking the log of the ratio of resources, dividing by n, well, that log causes that W to drop down. That W then divided by n equals P. And then we're taking and then also the product of a log is a sum. So we end up with a sum over, essentially an average over each of these allocations and rewards. And so Kelly in the 50s told us that with this type of setup, the optimal allocation is when your betting matrix is proportional to some model of the environment. It's totally optimal when this is P here, but if an agent is doing the best they can, it's with their quantity X. And so now this betting matrix becomes a probability distribution. We said earlier, W is a probability distribution. And so what we end up with is an information, a log of a distribution. And so the growth rate then becomes this information of the environment, events and signals, minus this DKL term, this information divergence between the agent's model and the true distribution in the environment. And so mutual information minus divergence. But what this is really saying is that the agent's growth rate is given by the optimal accuracy of their environment minus whatever inaccuracies they hold. And so this gives us an intuitive way to think about how growth on average, taking note that this is an average. So this is not on an intertemporal basis, but how well agents can grow. And so just to pause to think about what information tells us, as opposed to other quantities like correlation. Well, information is really, it's a more general statistical measure, whereas covariance implies some kind of linear relationship. And an information looks something like this, where you're taking the average over the log of the joint distribution over the marginals. So you're asking essentially how much more do you know about this, about these samples when you consider their joint rather than the marginals. And we can if we compare these two metrics on some sample data like I've done here, for this linear data, of course, there's really high correlation. If we were to ask what the information is, well, the uncertainty in variable y is some variable we're trying to predict, is given by this blue line here. By sampling x, we basically reduce the uncertainty in that variable y. So by knowing x, we have information about y. So in this case, we have high information and correlation. This data here, you can see with how the error bars are shaped, we lose a little bit of information. There's a little bit less correlation. But more importantly, when we look at some data like this, where there really is no correlation, of course, a good scientist would fit a different function to this and use different statistics. But what we see is in some cases where some simple intuitive metrics like covariance might not work, information works really well. We still have really high information on this type of data. So just think about information as another intuitive way to look at the relationship between two variables. And so now let's give an example. So imagine you're a farmer and your goal every season is to plant crops and get paid for it. At the beginning of each year, you receive some signals. There's some food price indices. You might look at data from an almanac, some other kinds of data. Well, that'll inform you on how you allocate your resources, which is basically, you go out and buy cattle, you plant your crops, and then at the end of the season, you receive some reward by how much crops you yielded how much you received for that at market. So we can ask in this system, where does the heterogeneity emerge? Heterogeneity being that really important determinant of inequality. Well, the first, if we can compute the variance exactly, we get a variance in information, a variance in divergence, as well as a covariance. This first term really tells you something about the environment the agent is in, what type of model and the quality of the signals you're using. The second term is just the divergence. So on, how heterogeneous is that understanding of the model that every agent has. And then as well as some covariance, where just an example of covariance could be that better models are harder to learn, where like if your I is really big, well, maybe your DKL across your population is also really high. That's an example of positive covariance. But for this work, we're going to assume a shared environment, which means that all agents are using the same signal in the same environment. So this first term vanishes and this third term vanishes. And we're just thinking about the variance and divergence. Okay. So going back to our growth rate term equation, we can actually study these dynamics by assuming some kind of model for the environment. And so what we have here is what I call the stationary multinomial model. I'll spare you the details, but just to think about it as correlated dice, where if you roll a 1 on one die, you're highly likely going to roll a 1 on the other die. And then all other options for that second roll are uniform, but some other value that sums up to be 1 minus b. And so when we make this assumption about the environment, we get some closed form expressions for the growth rate and the volatility, which makes doing physics really easy. The things to care about here is that this L represents essentially how many sides on the die there are. So when L is equal to 2, we have a coin. L is equal to 6, we have, I don't know, the die that you normally use. P is essentially that correlation between S and E. So when P is equal to 1, you're essentially rolling one die. And X is agent's guess for P. So Kelly tells us that when X is equal to P, we've optimized our growth. And as X diverges from P, we experience lower average growth. And then here's the expression for the volatility. And so when we go to simulate these dynamics using Monte Carlo techniques, and then we ask, well, how do those dynamics compare to a GBM model, geometric Brownian motion model, with these parameters? We find that there's basically no distinction. So on this plot here, as a function of time, we're simulating agents' resources as they're making guesses within this correlated dice environment, where red and orange are the GBM guess for the average growth, and the other is for the population average, and we see that they overlap perfectly well, where blue are the 95% confidence intervals as calculated by the volatility. So what we see basically is that there's perfect agreement between theory and simulation. Sorry about that. And this is great. This means that we can really study and understand GBM using this micro foundation for agent behavior. And so now let's actually introduce an adaptive mechanism. So we're going to say now that agents can actually gather information from their environment in an intuitive way by just seeing and observing and recording. And we're going to do this in a Bayesian way, where agents, as they're making observations, are just going to record and update their model. And what we should expect is that with many observations, their model of the environment converges to the true environment. And I just want to make a caveat here that we're analyzing a stationary environment. So this convergence is guaranteed. In reality, our environment changes all the time. So expecting true convergence isn't realistic, but for the sake of building a model and building intuition, it's very helpful. So when we consider Bayesian inference on this dice roll model we talked about earlier, we can use a method called from the ML literature called latent Dirichlet allocation. I won't give you the details here, but the main point is that it gives us a way of calculating closed form dynamics on that preference variable I mentioned earlier. And what it tells us is that as a function of lambda, which is time rescaled by some learning rates, you get nice power law convergence. So at lambda equals 0, your preference is set by the initial preference. And as lambda goes towards infinity, as time goes on, you converge to the optimal. And so if we ask what's the variance in decisions across a population, this variance in X, we can compute this to be a -2 power law as well. and then plot this compared to Monte Carlo simulations and see that, they over time they converge to 0. And we can then do a Taylor expansion to compute the variance and growth rates. And we see that the variance and growth rates also converges to 0 with the power law of -2. And so we can use this to then go back to those dynamics of resources in a Monte Carlo population, compare that to a homogeneous population, and ask what effect does this then have on inequality. And so starting with our homogeneous population in red, as we expect, our population is growing while becoming more unequal. So that's what this red line is doing here. The error bars representing that variance is growing. When we introduce heterogeneity at some initial time, we have some initial variance, of course, but more importantly, it grows quite rapidly as we have a heterogeneous population. And when we introduce learning now, we see that growth rates grow, of course, so our curve takes a different path. But more importantly, that increase in variance is now curtailed a little bit. We're not growing inequality as much. And we see this reflected in the metrics for inequality. So our Gini, even though the blue curve starts out next to the black curve, it has dynamics that resembles the red curve much more closely. And the second plot is for coefficient of variation. I won't get too much into it, other than that it tells us relatively how much are we growing versus becoming more unequal. And we see that the blue curve starts to go towards the red curve. So we're getting dynamics that over time look more and more like a homogeneous population. And so this is great, because now we've introduced a mechanism that helps us understand where heterogeneity can come from in terms of agent decision making. But we also now have this nice adaptive mechanism that, while increasing growth, also helps us attenuate inequality over time. So that's the end of the first part. And now we're going to, now that we have this theory of adaptation that works really well in this case, for this case of studying inequality, where the research went next was then understanding what else can we explore? Well, in the ecology literature, we generally have a really good understanding of what might drive cooperation among organisms that have a lot of similarities. So of course, naturally, you want to cooperate with your family. You cooperate with people who look like you. We cooperate more with people than we do with trees. For example, we call this homophilous models of cooperation. The flip side of that, heterophilous, or modes of cooperation between unsimilar agents, we understand and have quantitative models for a lot less. And so what I'm going to show you now in this next part is this by using information theory, we can start to understand why might heterophilous cooperation emerge. Okay, so to introduce heterogeneity back into the system, we're going to assume now that there's multiple signals that agents can make decisions of. And we're going to say each agent can get one signal. So therefore, by having two signals in the environment, we have two different types of agents. And so then the question is, well, what does the information look like in that case? So the information, we can calculate it using this recursive method, where it's the information of the first signal plus the second, conditional on the first, so we don't overcount that contribution of the overlap. But we can also compute it in this piecewise manner, where we calculate the information for the first, for the second, and then subtract away that overlap. Well, that overlap has some really nice behaviors, some nice qualities, particularly that it can be positive or negative. When it's positive, this combined information is less than the sum of its parts. Not so interesting. We call this redundancy. When R is less than 1, we get this really cool special case called synergy, where now there's a benefit to considering both signals together before making a decision. And so you can compute synergy using this. I won't get too much into it. But what this really means for making collective decisions is that this synergy gives us a way of thinking about that benefit. Particularly when there is synergy, making a collective decision is better than the sum of its parts. And therefore, agents who pool their information across several signals can experience that synergy and use it to grow more quickly. And so we call this challenge of actually identifying synergy in the environment, structuring your decision so that you can leverage it, the principle of maximum synergy, where agents, a group's growth is highest when they can actually access that synergy when making decisions. And so if we think about how this fits in with the multiplicative growth community, well, we have a pretty good understanding of why combining resources might be beneficial, in the sense that combining resources allows you to sample or to average out sampling noise. This information sharing introduces kind of a new axis to this cooperation problem. And we visualize it here, where volatility and growth are your two axes. Hedging by pooling resources allows you to reduce volatility, while pooling information by leveraging synergy, you can now increase your average growth. And so this really sets the stage for this new model. That by accessing this complementary information as a proxy for skills, you can introduce a new mode of cooperation, essentially. Okay, this isn't a mistake, sorry. Okay, so now let's go to actually modeling this and seeing how it emerges in practice. So going back to a Monte Carlo simulation, we're going to assign every agent a unique signal, assign them into a unique group, and then have them making decisions in their environment, growing while acquiring information. As a model of the environment, we're going to use something derived from logic gates. We call this the U XOR gate. We basically take an XOR gate, which has synergy only when all agents cooperate. We mix it up so that now we can actually get benefits or get synergy benefits when there's less than maximal cooperation. The gist is that if you ask as a function of the number of cooperants within a group, how much information do they have access to? It looks something like this, where on a log scale, we have a linear relationship, which means it's exponential. The takeaway point is in this environment, we get nice synergy properties. So for an environment with 2, 6, 12 signals, you get this much information for a group of this size. So we have now a model to actually work with. What happens when we put agents in it? What this plot is showing here is as a function of time, how much information are groups acquiring. So with kg equals 1, that's a group with 1 signal to make decisions with, and kg4 is 4 signals. And this is in an environment with 4 total signals. So 4 is the max that you can get. We see what we expect. With more signals present, you can access more information over time. And this then translates into more growth, where groups with more signals then grow the most quickly, which, great, this works. We can understand, or we can see some benefits to cooperation emerging by collectively making decisions. Well, we can ask 2 things. 1, how do we actually know this is synergy? 2, why are these error bars so big? So why can we approximate growth pretty well with 4 or 1, but not with 2 or 3? And we answer that question here. To answer the second one first, because it's the easier question, it's because there's this problem with choice. If you're agent 1 and you can only cooperate with 1 other agent, so form a group with kg2, you have 3 other agents to pick from. If you pick agent 1, you might have, or agent 2, you might have a lot less synergy than with agent 0. And so we visualize that here by comparing the information of a group when we've summed the information versus when we've pooled it. And so the difference when cooperants are 2 or 3 tells us roughly how much synergy are you getting by actually pooling your signals. And so what this shows is that depending on the combination of signals you have, you get much different quantities of synergy, which tells you that this problem of selecting a person to cooperate with is like, it can be, it's not straightforward, particularly from given some environment. I forget what the first question I asked was, sorry. I'm a little lightheaded. But the key point here is that problem of selection is really difficult, but also it's difficult to actually realize whether who you're cooperating with is a synergistic co-conspirator, if you will. And that learning synergy takes time. You know, it took 50 time steps for us to really clearly resolve differences between these groups. And this is an environment where I cooked up like very obvious advantages, but you can imagine in different kinds of environments, actually resolving that synergy can become really difficult. Okay, so as an upshot, we've one generalized interaction benefits to arbitrary order by introducing this information-driven cooperation method. But we've also allowed this cooperation to emerge among heterogeneous agents. So we've derived a theory for heterophilous cooperation, all in terms of some interaction between an agent and their environment. So that was what we did for cooperation. And now on to the last part of this talk, is starting to develop a way to think about competitive systems using this theory. And so just to give some motivation for this part of the talk, I've been working with some political scientists who are thinking about how if you work for somebody and they expect some kind of deliverable from you, but that is at odds with some motive you have. We call this the principal agent problem. How do you arrive at some steady state of decisions of performance within your work? And so in this type of interaction can be generalized to what we call decision markets, where people are making some kind of guess of the value of something out in the world, and we all have to kind of come to an agreement. And generally, we're going to study this problem through this problem of convergence of preferences. And so we're going to assume that our environment now is purely social. So you're interacting with some other agent that can learn. And we're going to ask, well, if they're observing my behavior and I'm observing their behavior, and we're both updating our behavior in response, how then, what are then the dynamics of our behavior? Okay. So we're going to consider agent A and agent B. We're not assuming any structure to like who's boss. We're just assuming that they're all kind of interacting and learning. And they have respective behavior X and Y. And so we're saying, of course, they want to coordinate their actions so that over time their behaviors converge. And the question then is how quickly and to what value do those preferences converge? And so the model diagram looks something like this, where the agents have some behavior sampled from a distribution like before. They observe each other's behavior and then update their model of their behavior for future interactions. And so we're going to assume that behaviors are normally distributed, which makes things easy for us. We're going to assume that dynamics are considered only to the first order, so just this mean, which we'll call the preference, and that we're going to strengthen their initial behavior with some alpha and beta. We can think about this as like a stubbornness. How unwilling are they to change? And so first, we're going to consider the noise-free case, where the uncertainty in behavior goes to 0, and we're just thinking about preferences. So when alpha is equal to beta and they have the same amount of stubbornness, we get some boring power law convergence. I won't show you. But when alpha is not equal to beta, we get some interesting weighted average of the initial preferences, and the details are in the paper we wrote. But if we ask, what does this look like on a plot? What does that look like? So this, on the x-axis, we have as a function of time on a log scale. Because this is some power law convergence, it makes more sense to look at it on a log. We've cut off the initial part so that we can really focus on that convergence. And so on this left plot, we're holding constant agent A's stubbornness and just varying agent B, and vice versa for the second plot. And then we're varying agents B on each trajectory. So agent A starts out with a preference of 1, agent B with a preference of 5. And so we can see as agent B becomes more stubborn, agent A's preference converges more towards agent B's initial. So by being more stubborn, agent B is saying, no, you behave more like me over time. And we can see similar behavior for when we vary agent A's preferences. But the key point is that by how we've set this up, preferences always converge. So this difference in behavior always converges to 0. And so now let's consider what happens when we add noise. Well, this now becomes a process of diffusion. We can study this using the Fokker-Planck equation, and we can solve the difference equation and get an approximation for the sum. What we end up getting is some funny looking variance for that convergence process that is a dynamical quantity that looks like this. The key point is that in the numerator, we have something that's t to the cube. In the denominator, something that's t to the t cubed, t to the fourth, which means this converges to zero. So this uncertainty in that convergence process also goes to zero. And so we can study this using Monte Carlo simulations again. And so as a function of time, we're plotting the difference in preferences between the two agents. We see that difference in preferences goes to zero on a log scale. And then we see some interesting behavior in that variance where it initially increases and then decreases. So it does converge over a long time, but in intermediate times, it does something kind of interesting. This inflection point we call, well, it's not an inflection point, but this peak, we call the characteristic time. And what it really is representing is this balance between the uncertainty in behavior and this memory process that's really causing these preferences to kind of slow down over time. What I didn't mention earlier is we have this rescaling quantity, R of t, that represents agent's memory, basically. That's what's causing that power law convergence. And so this balance of noise introduced by behavior and this learning process is really determining where, how big that peak is occurring. But ultimately, the convergence does occur. And so then you can ask, well, if there is entropy in the system and it's leaving this difference process, well, where is it going? Turns out it's going into the sum. So really where those preferences actually converge to. And so we can study this by asking, well, what is the difference in that sum of behaviors at initial times and final time? And so that quantity is plotted in purple. And so for this set of parameters, that sum doesn't change, but we can see over time that uncertainty is increasing. So where the entropy is being stored in there. Whereas we ask then, what is the difference, this delta ym is the difference between agent y's behavior and the mean. Of course, as we would guess, that delta would go to zero as the preference is converging to the mean, but we see also that the uncertainty starts to decrease as the uncertainty in the sum is increasing. So this is just showing empirically that those uncertainties are now being hidden somewhere else in the system. Okay, so the upshot of this research is that we now have a model that produces this convergent behavior that can be useful for studying these dynamical systems. We see that this convergence happens. We can understand where the noise is stored, but importantly, we have this characteristic time that tells us how does this convergence actually behave. Okay, so as a recap, we have this problem of studying adaptive systems without adaptive processes. And we explored that particularly using the case of geometric Brownian motion. And although these systems require heterogeneity to really make sense, we started out without a model to actually understand where heterogeneity comes from. And so we introduced a method for heterogeneity, introduced a mechanism that allows us to now study adaptation, and then use that to kind of close this heterogeneity problem within the GBM literature. And then we took this newfound understanding of the role of information in governing growth dynamics into understanding cooperative behavior by studying information synergy, and then use that to study how do agents actually make this decision, or how difficult this problem of finding cooperants can be. We modeled this, studied some of those properties of information, and then extended this model additionally to studying adaptive behavior. And so what's next? First, going back to that diagram of complementary modes of cooperation, the big question is then, well, how do these different modes actually express themselves at different scales? So generally, when volatilities are correlated, sharing resources doesn't really make sense. And when information is more or less complementary, sharing information might not make sense. And so we would think that different cooperating strategies fall somewhere on this spectrum. So focusing on a firm, for example, Well, a conglomerate is a kind of firm that hedges its resources across types of companies. That's a resource sharing dominant strategy, whereas a supply chain, which relies on a lot of complementary, production, might rely a lot more on information complementarity. But we can extend this discussion to social organizations like towns, villages, cities, nations, etc. At what scales do different modes of cooperation really matter? Second, I've only talked about cases of an adaptation that are really simple, where if you learn your parameter really well, you're guaranteed to converge to the maximum growth rate, and that change is monotonic. But what happens when that change isn't monotonic? When you actually have some choice of, well, if I learn, it might take a long time before I actually, reach that peak, and reaching that peak might mean some period of low growth. This is a open question in the sociological literature, and understanding why some people make different decisions on different timescales. And is also becoming more of an open question in the AI community of understanding how do reinforcement learners learn in really complex environments. So we've begun thinking about this problem as well. And then lastly, expanding the thing I was just talking about, scaling up this competitive dynamic to understand prediction markets. So when you have many interacting agents, when we've introduced some things that might change that characteristic time through some pure noise or through some actually what we call a reality check with some stationary signal. How do preferences actually converge in these systems? And then how can we grow this to understand like actual decision markets? And so that's it. That's where the work is going. And so just for the brief credits, I want to thank my family for always supporting me, obviously, and coming out and making the journey today and being here. I want to thank my collaborators. I'm not going to stop to turn this thing off like it's, whatever. But first, of course, Luis, I couldn't have asked for like a better, more supportive, liberating advisor for this whole process. He's basically just said, hey, here's some ideas, go explore them and explore them on your own time. And so I had a lot of freedom there, which is really nice. Also, Adam Klein for answering the call when I needed him, as well as my international collaborators who helped me particularly with these political science problems. I want to also thank some other people at the UChicago community, particularly people who I used to work with in the PME, with whom I did my master's, as well as collaborators in the psych department, like Mark Berman, Andrew Steer, as well as Julia Kaczynski at the Spatial Data Science Institute, who's just really helped me out a lot over the last year. I also want to thank some people just from my past who, particularly people from high school who gave me a lot of confidence and instilled in me like professional ethics. My undergrad advisor, Roger Tobin, and Brittany Kamai for really embracing me as a young researcher and tempering my anxieties and helping me grow into a confident researcher. Professor Munduchin for teaching me how fun math can be and how much impact you can have with good research. Yeah, as well as our our great support staff here at UChicago. The tons of people who helped me find community here. There's a lot of you, as well as my great committee for letting me explore like just wild stuff that when I explain to people, they say, how is that physics? How are you doing a physics PhD with that? Particularly when I emailed Sid to ask him to be on my committee, he was like, I don't know what that is, but that sounds exciting. Let's do it. So thank you. But this reflects broadly the wonderful interdisciplinary research attitude we have here at the department, which I tell people this all the time. I would have probably not finished my PhD if I didn't come here. So, nice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll come over here so I can be seen on Zoom. Thank you all so much. The committee is going to get their private time to ask Jordan questions. I want to give an opportunity for a couple of questions from you all. So please, I'll ask Jordan to direct traffic. Try to keep it brief. We want to make sure that we get Jordan to the next stages as quickly as possible, but please ask away.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really lovely. And I had a bunch of questions, but I'll go with recency bias.
Okay.
About the last one.
Yeah.
About the convergence.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you had considered or know of cases where you have considered agents who would purposely like to anti-coordinate. So if you know someone's investing in something, you don't want to do that, that's overproductive.
Yeah, I was thinking about this lately. Oh, yeah. So the question was, what if you have agents who try to anti-coordinate, where instead of exhibiting convergent behavior, you then have some other kind of behavior? Well, I think there's a good chance in that case, and this is just me thinking out loud, is, well, the one agent can basically apply a transform to the other agent's behavior so that you still get some kind of convergent behavior, but it's not necessarily to the same value, but some same value in that transform space. So I think it might end up being like a very similar situation, as long as that antisocial behavior, if you will, is also stationary. If they're constantly flipping back and forth, well, then you're basically just introducing noise, and I don't know if you actually get convergence. So, yeah. Yeah.
To go back to your first slide.
Yeah.
And so, right, so great motivation, right? So you
Yeah.
have this particle level interaction forces, but then you have behavior and so on, right? And
Yeah.
working with social systems,
Yeah.
small
Yeah.
Generalize or what are similarities or differences where we diverge from our description of molecules up to particles, body systems, and then to human beings? What can we generalize about dynamics, and does it depend on the level at which you course read?
Yeah, so there are some people at SFI right now who are thinking about this problem of, well, one, reformulating this problem of like information driving dynamics in terms of like more common thermodynamic quantities like free energy and stuff like that. So I guess to answer that question, like coarse graining in our case really involves just like averaging, right? So we're thinking particularly about what happens when you average over signals. In that case, you get now some kind of fixed rules, right? And then that might make the aggregation process more simple. What I'm getting at is that there's a lot of different ways to think about this. I think this problem or this thought about, and this is probably where I should have started this answer actually. Sorry. Almost there. Okay. So this diagram of understanding understanding like how aggregation actually occurs at different scales. I mean, we have people, particularly Adam here on campus, who think about how difficult this problem of coarse graining is when you have so many different heterogeneous modes of interaction. Well, in social systems now, the balance of those modes change at different scales. So you might need to apply a different coarse graining technique depending on whether we're talking about people in a collaborations in an institutes in, you know, like the NSF or something. We're working right now on figuring out whether phase transitions, for example, exist within a single level between different modes, so we get an understanding of that, how within a mode what that behavior looks like. But in terms of actually carrying out that coarse graining, in terms of like building up this ladder, if you will, we haven't thought much about it, because there's so many things, and that's really my answer to a lot of questions, is like there's so many like small theory questions we need to answer first before we actually build the mechanisms for that. Hope I answered the question. One more, or you can ask me later. Yeah, okay.
There, I think we might want to move on. Sorry about that, but you'll have some more time with Jordan. I'm going to ask that we thank him again in just a second. But before that, I wanted to say that give us about 30 minutes and converge on the Betancourt lab space, which is again, Ermin 210. Brandon is your fearless leader to get you over there. And then we'll bring Jordan to you essentially at the end. So thank you. Let's thank Jordan again.
So thank you, Zoom people. I'm gonna open a breakout room for me and Arvind, and the rest of you are encouraged to leave.